Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Alicia Suggs. I'm the Director of University and Alumni Relations, part of the Metro New York chapter of the National Black MBA Association. We have a great webinar in store for you. We have Erica Edwards O'Neill, Esquire, here joining us. She's going to be giving her perspective on the truth of diversity and inclusion. Just to address some housekeeping rules, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box. I will be checking the chat box sporadically as we step through our discussion. But I want to introduce our special guest speaker today, Erica Edwards O'Neill, Esquire. She is the Senior Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Social Responsibility at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. For more than a decade, she has provided training and guidance on cultural competence, educational pipeline initiatives, professional development, and a variety of diversity and inclusion related matters. Erica has a long-standing commitment to diversity and public service, having had previous experiences serving as the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion, Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Director of a Legislative Advocacy Coalition, and as Community Development Liaison. Erica received her bachelor's in government from the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and her Juris Doctor from Toro Law Center in Long Island, New York. Erica has been recognized by the Tri-State Diversity Council and the National Black Pre-Law Conference for her work. She currently resides in New York with her husband and her 4 daughters. So with that, hi Erica, how are you?
I'm good. How are you all?
Great, great. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Absolute honor.
So let's just jump right into it. Before we get started, I want you just to, explain what New York City Economic Development Corporation is and how did you get into diversity and inclusion?
Okay, so the New York City Economic Development Corporation is a largest governmental non-for-profit. It is really the economic arm and engine for New York City. Our projects look like the High Line, New York City ferries, large projects and developments. We are less than, BAT, again, I don't know if I said the ferries, we're less than 600 folks, but 27 different departments. And those departments are it is neighborhood planning and strategy. It is the ferry system, life sciences, initiatives, strategic investments, economic research and analysis, as well as like budgeting, contracting, the creative side. So we do a great deal of hiring, but a large deal of our focus, a bit of our focus is on planning, economic development, and real estate investment and transactions, and also asset management. So.
Great, great. So you're a lawyer. How did you get into diversity and inclusion industry?
Absolutely. So I started off focusing on always being interested in kind of EO and civil rights. And so went not directly to practicing, but working in an advocacy role. So with the Time Dollar organization in Washington, D.C., and then later in New York in a variety of different roles. And so it has always been a passion, and in particular, I will say pipelining, right? The notion that being the only in any space and wondering why that is. And so the other really quick story I'll tell is that I come from a small town in Virginia. I've been in New York for 24 years, but myself and my best friend had an extraordinary guidance counselor, an older Black woman that for every student that was graduating and going off to college, it wasn't just that college admissions space. She was earnestly visiting that first year like a parent, talking to us about kind of finances. You're at a school where there may be a great deal of wealth and you don't have that. So let's talk about how you manage it. But she really talked to us about the fact that she was going to serve as a bridge to ensure that we didn't remain the only. And that stuck with me. And so I actually say my best friend is actually a guidance counselor overseeing an entire district in Virginia. But it was really impactful for me, the understanding of what needed to happen for folks to have that bridge. And so naturally, when I entered the legal field, there were just not enough people of color, not enough Black folk in law school, in the legal field, and that's still true today. And at some point I would say, like, what industry, where are we represented? And you see all the stories and all the data, And so I just became extremely interested in that, and I started off working in law school in career services with the notion that I didn't have that assistance when I graduated. I felt like, some folks go to law school, as with all the other graduates, lots of other graduate schools, it may be family relationships or a strong network. And for a lot of myself and my friends, we were feeling our way through, and I really wanted to focus on higher education pipelining in that way, specifically in a legal institution. Equal Justice Works had a poster, and I have it up in my office, and it says, "Yes, the world still does need another lawyer," and that is still true. So that's really how I started off, and I started off focusing in career services and really starting to dig into some of the data around what the barriers were to law, to entry, and then looking at what some of the commonalities were in that space. And then I started to follow folks who are women who I think actually are like pioneers in this space. Verne Myers, who was focusing on implicit bias when no one was talking about it many, many moons ago, looking at Harvard's implicit association test, as well as Professor Jerry Kang and the work that he was doing also around bias and perception, and started to really kind of hone what I wanted to be doing in that space. And it was specifically around pipelining. And so that led me into D&I. I've been in that space actually now for probably more than 15 years. And with initial focus on law school and then graduate school. And then the opportunity presented itself for New York City Economic Development Corporation, which was really a merger of all those things, because there's not one particular degree or background or experience. It was a wide range of experiences that I thought would be an opportunity that I could kind of jump into and retool.
That's amazing. So I know that diversity and inclusion can mean many things to different people. It can mean, having more people of color as your staff, or at an employer, or having people with different sexual orientation or gender. What does diversity and inclusion mean to you?
It means diversity does mean valuing differing perspectives, ideas, backgrounds, and contributions. And that it absolutely is inclusive of race. And I like to say this the way the folks at Race Forward, which is an amazing organization, say this is a race and conversation. So we may start the conversation with race, but we're looking at gender, you're looking at socioeconomic status, you're looking at parents, people with disability, you're looking, and I'm going to focus a lot because I'm still Southern and I'm trying to, do all the standard language. And really exploring. And so the one thing I'd say, but I do press pause on the inclusion. I know that we hear diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I really earnestly try to move to a place where we're talking about diversity and equity, because inclusion means there was something here that is built out already and we're inviting you to the table. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but inclusion often means, hey, here, have a seat. It might not be comfortable for you because it wasn't built for you. And so I really do think about the rethinking of what inclusion looks like, and the rethinking of what these spaces are that we're in, air quotes, inviting people into. Some places need to be rethought, re-envisioned, and rebuilt that truly are more inclusive.
That's really, really good to know. I've had some colleagues in the past state that some companies view D&I departments as areas to bring diversity to their companies. However, once they are hired, there's no pipeline to help them grow within the company. What are your views on that, and how do you view D&I at EDC?
D&I at EDC is, I really am, I am proud of the movement, the work that we've done, especially over the last 4 or so years. And one of the things is I'm a huge advocate for being transparent. We've made a lot of progress and we still have progress to go. In terms of getting folks in, I think we often focus on what I call like the bucket that we're going to pour in diversity. So we're going to diversify the applicant pool, and then we're going to hire, and no one is paying attention to the huge gaping hole in the floor and where we're losing people. And so that notion, that goes back to the notion of what inclusion means. It is, yes, we're making a commitment to hire, and yes, we're going to look at more diverse applicant pools and more diverse institutions and associations. But if you haven't considered what folks take to thrive and not just survive, and what are you inviting them to, if it is, we're inviting you to come in and assimilate and to be exactly like us, think the way, speak the way, integrate, meanwhile saying bring your whole self. It's about a rethinking of that conversation. And I may be jumping ahead, and often it requires folks to look at their policies and practices to say, where may we be unintentionally creating harm, for lack of a better word, or asking folks to be smaller or bringing less of themselves, policies that look facially like they are good for everyone, but they were not, again, unless you're talking new startups, most organizations and institutions were not built with diverse workforces in mind. They just were not, when the workday was even conceived, it did not consider working mothers, it did not consider people with disabilities, it did not consider Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so when I often talk to folks at previous places or people I may be consulting with, those conversations, like, I just say, well, we couldn't find people and then we thought we just can't keep them. And then you ask about, well, what have you done differently? Or did you just say, here, come squeeze into this box with me without any asking kind of, how are you checking in with your workplaces? Are you doing climate surveys, engagement surveys? Have you done the bare minimum as for things like cultural awareness months, creative ideas to let folks know that you're talking about all types of diversity? Have you started employee resource groups, and are you funding those groups, right? And so I know those are questions that, we're coming up later, but
Okay.
I'll stop talking.
So does your organization have annual trainings to bring awareness to diversity, such as unconscious bias trainings? And if so, what type of company training do you recommend for other D&I leaders like yourself?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. No worries.
Go ahead.
No worries. No worries. Yes, we do provide training. And so we start with, for the last 2 years, we've had mandatory new hire implicit bias or unconscious bias training that is provided by the Vernay Myers company. I mentioned her earlier, really one of the earliest folks to focus on bias in all industries. I would also point out that we are very intentional about who we do business with, who's providing our training. And so we make a great effort to include MWDBEs to ensure that we have a wide breadth of diverse firms represented. So that's baseline. There should be implicit bias, unconscious bias training, whichever name we want to give it, for new hires. But that also means you need to normalize that language for current employees, making sure that you're offering unconscious bias trainings for your full staff. And so what we offer is one training from the Perception Institute that is bias, mind sciences, bias, and racial anxiety. It's a fantastic training. It runs about an hour and a half. And so just recently, everyone from our our president's office and all of our senior VPs have gone through that training, and it will be offered to the rest of the organization. Quarterly, because we are an organization that focuses on development, real estate, and planning, we offer redlining training, right? It's important for people to understand some of those institutions of structural racism where we can still see the impacts today. So that has been super pleased. We started having the training as what we call a policy to practice, like a Brownback lunch and learn once or twice a year. And then our President's office was extremely supportive and understanding the value. And so now we offer that training once a quarter, and just recently added a redlining 102 that really talks about moving from understanding redlining, its implication and its effects, to what ways do we look to bridge the gap, talking about the wealth gap, but also, actually I should say that training, the redlining training is a not-for-profit offers that training based out of the Bronx, and they're called Undesign the Redline, and Designing the We. So,
what is redlining?
Redlining was the process of really legalized discrimination as it relates to real estate and property. For instance, truly maps that had lines drawn around them about where folks could get mortgages, where they couldn't get mortgages, where insurance was going to be higher or underinsured, where banks, and it really a structure of banks, real estate professionals, insurance professionals undervaluing certain areas. It actually explains, has a lot to do in the planning field, where you see why are these drastic changes in neighborhoods and the change of value, or while there's in some instances in parts of the country, people simply built walls up around the undesired neighborhoods or the red line neighborhoods so that their property could grow and increase in value. It is an absolutely arbitrary system that was on the books, well, for a long time, and it still has traces today. And it's one of the key reasons why we see undervaluing of property in Black and brown neighborhoods.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So I'll just add on really quickly. So I think I talked about designing the redlining training, unconscious bias. We do microaggressions trainings. We some are external, some are in-house. We have imposter syndrome training, but also things like disability etiquette, conversations around parenting in the workplace, and we do lots of partnerships with our employee resource groups. We have 4. We have a people of color resource group, employee resource group, women's resource group, an LGBTQ plus resource group, and a parents resource group. And they roll in under me, and we co-sponsor quite frequently programs, events and tours. And I wanted to pause here to say, the change doesn't just happen with training. So I'm pointing out that the notion of opportunities for conversation, for creating safe space. We have a mindfulness group, but for instance, we'd say our people of color group, my diversity team, and maybe the mindfulness group partnered last year to host Gotham tours, which is Black Gotham tours. They are based in Lower Manhattan, and it was a tour of like Black spaces in Lower Manhattan for Black History Month. So I think it's like a layering of all this work. It is not training only, and it is not one person that's doing the work. This does not rest with me. The D&I person has to be consultative, and this has to be work that everyone owns and supports. And so I'll stop. I'll get off my I see some hands. I think I saw some questions. I don't know if it's too soon.
If you guys have any questions, please enter them in the chat box. I'll take your questions from there and just answer them as we go along. I don't see any yet.
One comment, let's see.
See a comment, let's see.
Okay, I think that one came to me privately. But
oh,
how do you, I'll jump in. How do you institute kind of cultural awareness month? We like really easy lifts. There are folks, the diversity, best practices, Tannenbaum Interreligious Institute, these folks who have diversity calendars, they have religious diversity calendars. We also did a training on religious understanding, but simply acknowledging, sending out a calendar, and utilizing that as a tool for managers, saying, we want you to be aware these are upcoming events that might affect your scheduling. We want to make sure that you may have employees that are participating in cultural or religious celebrations. It simply may be an email that goes out monthly. We have an email that goes out monthly that lists cultural events internally, externally, volunteer opportunities. We will sometimes have programming, but not on everything that's in the calendar. But we want to make people aware that we hear you and thinking about your whole self. If there is something that we can do that you want to see that's not happening, that's not being acknowledged, please let us know and we will integrate that. And so that grows that effort. And it doesn't, some folks say, I have this conversation, people say, we just don't have the money. And I can say, I have started these on a shoestring budget, right? And each time I've had this role, it was like the one woman band, what do you call it? One band? Like it was just me, right? Right? And maybe an intern. So it was looking at what I am forever. I will utilize a documentary, a screening, and host a discussion. I will look to my peer networks to say, I heard you speak on this. Can you come in and share in this space? When we're looking to build up to the momentum to training, there are so many other ways to have conversations, and also looking at this as an opportunity to give folks within the organization new opportunities to lead. If you have people who are in junior roles, who are maybe in administrative roles, things like employee resource groups, policy to practice, like lunch and learns or panels are great ways to allow other folks to host, to lead, to flex, and that, but that has to tie into your leadership valuing that.
Great. I have another question from Anthony. Can you talk more about the corporate excuse of not finding enough diverse candidates for open roles and how you address that?
I'm gonna not speak in the vernacular here. That it's just false, right? I hear it in every industry, and every industry tells me that they are unique. And while I say there may be roles that are where the pool is a little bit more shallow, right? There may be roles where, but the notion that you cannot find anyone is, I always ask where you're looking, right? And so I used to give this example that I don't walk into a pizza shop and ask for egg foo young, right? Where are you looking? If you want diverse talent, you have got to move beyond the simple places where you've just been posting. Often folks focus on their alumni networks because that's easy. I went to X school, I'll just call them and they'll send me someone great, or I'll tap into my network. But the problem is your network often looks exactly like you, so you're going to continue to get exactly like you.
Mm-hmm.
And I say to folks, you've got to tell me that you have gone to wherever you're located. And for New York, the CUNYs, your SUNYs, your HBCUs, and your tribal institutions. Build a relationship with them. And not just, people understand when you're just showing up to check a box as well. It is, where can you show up and establish these relationships and to go deeper in that space? And I also believe, much like this fantastic association, there is an association for nearly everything. And so when you tell me that you're looking and you can't find, I can often rattle off a number of different associations where it's like, do you have a relationship? Do you have, your funds are limited? Okay, what can you volunteer to do with them? You need to establish a relationship and start to share and ask where and how you can serve so that you develop the pipeline. Mm-hmm. So one step, I always ask people, what's your data around that? And are you keeping track? Do you actually have a diverse pool and people are coming to the door, but not through the door? That's an entire different conversation.
I have another question for you. So this person asks, my organization has recently formed a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. Are there any resources that you can recommend for newly formed diversity, equity, and inclusion committees?
Yes, let me say one, if your organization is a non-for-profit, I would say to look at GARE, Government Alliance on Race Equity. They have tons of resources. If it's not a non-for-profit, I'd say look to the Management Center, extraordinary management training organization based out of Washington, D.C., extraordinarily diverse, and they have tons of free resources. On their site, there will be a section that just says equity and inclusion resources, and everything from hiring, recruiting, giving, understanding how to give effective feedback, bias. They have so much free information there. The non-for-profit resources, GARE, Government Alliance on Race Equity. Also, Race Forward is another organization. I can't think of their full site. The Management Center, look for, in terms of like trainings and folks who do great, just extraordinary work. I'm going to rattle off a couple, but I will always share this back. The Perception Institute, also a woman-led organization. Inclusion Strategy with Paula Edgar, an extraordinary woman who's offering tons of free resources right now. So her name is Ritu Basin, R-I-T-U, last name B-H-A-S-I-N. And I think her company is Basin Consulting. Yeah, R-I-T-U. She right now, because of the crisis in COVID, has been offering almost all of her webinars for free, which is, they're normally not free. And they've been extraordinary. Everything from allyship to building strong coalitions. Let me think of this. Perception Institute, GARE, Race Forward. There will also be tons of great information. I'm not sure what your industry is, but there's an upcoming conference called the Hindsight Conference. Mm-hmm. With it's going to be a virtual conference. It's going to be focusing on the planning profession, which is, it really is an overlap for planning, finance, real estate, law, and there'll be a lot of great presentations that really address this space. what else is really extraordinary for equity work? I will tell you, it's a lot. The Management Center, the Perception Institute, GARE, and Race Forward. Race Forward also has a conference coming up. And so listen here. So the one benefit is that some of these conferences that we couldn't get to or couldn't afford are now virtual. And um, and clearly things I'm very excited. I also tell people that I am super nosy, so I like researching anything, and this is like my dream to just sit in a chair and rattle off things. Um, gosh, what is the other place? I just lost it. It'll come back to you. I'll give the resource.
Okay. I'll definitely share with everyone. If somebody said don't stop, we can definitely share some resources that Erica has been providing to us after today's webinar. I know we have some more questions, but I do want to get to some of mine, but let me answer one more. This person said, what should be in place of inclusion, and should we ask that inclusion be changed, and to what?
For us, we've moved from, I've moved to using just, for us, we're diversity, equity, and social responsibility.
Okay.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion with an understanding that how you're prioritizing, right? So you're diversifying a place, you're centering equity, and then we can talk about including, like what the inclusion process looks like, or some folks talk about include. I think it's, if you can define it, maybe it's just not, I am nervous about the folks who do a knee-jerk hiring of a D&I professional and want to focus on the inclusion part without the tough conversation. And so I can say one of the things that I am so proud of is that I have seen our leadership go boldly and are allowing us to have the conversation about what equity looks like, what anti-racist policies look like, right? Conversations that we could not have had a year ago. And so I just, when people are saying inclusion, at the very least, I want you to have a conversation about what it means, what it represents, and so to not lean on it as a fix-all.
Got it. We have another question for Andrew. Can you speak to the impact of social distancing on the development of Black and Brown relations within various organizations? For example, networking and relationship development, the challenges coming of authentic via online versus in person.
And here's what's interesting. I think that it is an absolute challenge, because you're gonna have to work harder and be much more intentional about creating the connections and then getting comfortable quickly. The reverse is that I do see some barriers being removed because of remote access, right? And so I look at, there are definitely conferences and resources and people that you now have access to that you maybe would not have. And I'm going to give the example as Kimberly Crenshaw, I didn't mention as a resource. Kimberly Crenshaw is a Black female law professor who coined the phrase intersectionality. You've heard it a lot. Kimberly Crenshaw is responsible for that. And she's Kimberly, Kimberlee,
Okay.
if you're looking her up. She is co-founder of the African American Policy Forum. They're doing a lot of work around the Say Her Name movement, and then about police violence and brutality against Black women. But there would normally be a critical race theory, maybe conference or something happening in California. Because of our current situation, I participated last week in a 5-day critical race theory with some of the most brilliant Black and Brown minds in this space for a third of the price. And they were very intentional about creating breakout room spaces and having people virtual social hours where it was small group, and insisting that like people be present so they could talk. Please don't leave. We want to create relationship. There was document sharing, resource sharing, and they kept creating small breakout space to have some uncomfortable conversations. And what we found is that when you come back to the larger conversations, people are a little bit more comfortable, but it also led to the, hey, I made this connection with someone. There was the messaging around encouraging that. And so I know that is not, like that was just my own personal situation. And I know that it will be challenging, but I encourage folks to still have that same level of braveness. Well, all that you can be told is no. still looking out for informational interviews, or I've seen our internal employee resource group do wonderful things like, coffee or breakfast chats where it's like grabbing my coffee, grabbing my tea together on some informational calls or quick check-ins. And also moving to something that I learned, and this is the resource I was going to share, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. The People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They're based out of New Orleans. They're the folks who've been talking about undoing racism for 50 plus years. True warriors in this space, but they remind, I attended their training at the Ford Foundation a couple of years ago. And one of the things is they remind us to go slow, to understand like what community building looks like in all the spaces. So sometimes we go, and I am guilty of this today. I jumped right on the call with Alicia and just started talking. Sometimes it's just sit quiet, like, hey, how was your day? How's the family? Just trying to create some space for people to show up. And I'm one of those people that I have a broken filter, so I don't mind laying myself bare. I want people to say, like, these are my challenges. This is where my filter is broken, so we could create some comfort level to speak. And I'm also verbose, if you haven't picked that up. I have a lot of words.
No, it's totally fine. So what do you think should change in the corporate world in order to see the diversity percentage shift in the executive C-suite?
I think we've got to have, there's got to be some accountability about, and in law firms that do this, an understanding of who was in that pool, who made it to finals, who didn't. There should be meetings about that, right? You had a diverse slate and a diverse candidate wasn't selected, so all things equal, and again, we don't have a diverse hire, let's talk about that. All right, so that's the post conversation, but the pre-conversation are, HR and talent teams. That's my dog, so.
It's fine.
He really got excited about this conversation. HR and talent teams having pre-meetings before the hire and before the job posting. One, reviewing job postings for gendered language, for language that might require over hiring, for language that might be naturally intimidating. We know the data shows, one, right, as we talk about even just men and women, I think the notion says that women feel like they typically need to have like 90% of the qualifications to apply, and men are like, got 50, that's cool. I'll throw my hat in the ring. So
True.
Also looking at, are you asking for a PhD when you just need a bachelor's here? And what's the true equivalent to this experience? Is it, what does qualified look like, right? Maybe there are some folks from the community or neighborhood or someone who's had life experiences that equate to this that you are now minimizing. And also, what assumptions are you making about what particular schools, right? So that there's that challenge for that. But also what I was going to say is that the Management Center has a wonderful resource about hiring and a hiring rubric that discusses your must-have versus your want-to-have. So people and diverse candidates don't make it often on the nice-to-have. Like, that whole notion around what does it mean to say you're looking for a cultural fit when you really need a cultural add? That's that in the difference. Like that's that difference. And when you force people to parse that, to pull it out, to separate it, it is much harder. And often well-meaning people go, right, you're right. I don't need that. Yeah, okay, all right.
Interesting. Do you feel that historic corporate culture has slowed down the process of invoking more inclusivity in the workplace? And if so, what tactics would you use to see that change?
Absolutely. I think that one is that we talk about the same notions of hiring from the same networks and being slow to change, unless we're talking about new tech startups and such. Folks like things to be done in a safe way. There's also the notion of, stock and shareholder, corporations are risk averse and typically go with what they know. And diversity can be scary if you're saying, what I need to change, what am I giving up, right? There's still a notion of the pie concept. But also even so many corporations, we talk about things where remote work or flexibility would lead to greater diversity, right? And so let's think about all the places that said that wasn't even a possibility before COVID, and we could see how quickly folks pivot. So it is just a naturally slow space. And even thinking about, as right now my conversation, a lot of it has been focused on race. I do want to point out that in terms of people with disability in New York State and New York City, so many qualified people, and I don't even know the numbers, but I would urge you to look it up, that the unemployment rates, even in great times for people with any form of disability, is extraordinarily high. And that really, you really think trace that back to bias about who do you see. I often give this equation, and I say, you know, there's a high-powered attorney that runs upstairs to the office, is met by the secretary ushers the attorney into the room to meet the Fortune 500 client sitting at the table. Did anyone picture a person as being in a wheelchair? Any of the high-powered people, right? How many people saw the secretary, when I said a secretary or admin person, being male or being, you know? So there are all these things that just absolutely happen or are plugged in that place, and it really relates to bias about what we see. We often also, representation absolutely matters, because I think about that when I say, please don't just bring in Black speakers during Black History Month. If you were talking about stocks, bonds, investments, there are diverse folks doing a lot of different things. And so start to normalize diversity in spaces and sectors that you haven't seen it. That too is changing the culture.
Right. We have a question from Andrea. Can Erica speak to systems in place at her company that are designed to minimize the discriminatory or disparate impact caused by artificial intelligence, AI, when scrubbing resumes, applications submitted by BIPOC?
Yes, so we've just started experimenting with the scrubbed resume, and we are doing that with one or two pilot teams. So we don't actually, what the institutions we have right now are really focusing on, it's a lot of person-to-person conversation. Like again, like job postings and descriptions don't go up without there being a meeting with the talent team, without there being there's a if you are interviewing or responsible for hiring, you must participate in an interview training. We've moved from, we've in the last year moved from often we do often a lot of kind of the 1-2 more panel interviewing to help balance out the bias. But in terms of looking at other ways for AI, we're not there yet. We've done some of the scrubbing, we've done the gendered language search and such. So that's what we've done thus far. So
great. What are your thoughts on white privilege and its part in diversity race discussions? It's a question from the chat.
That it should be acknowledged, right? And acknowledged without this whole notion is that I think when people talk about a superpower, my superpower is that I don't have a feel. Like we're going to acknowledge power, privilege. Don't have it. And so one is that when I do diversity and inclusion trainings, I don't start them without talking about power, privilege, and identity, right? Don't ignore it. It's there and it exists. And so if you can identify with some layer of privilege, I say this all the time. When I get out of my car and walk to a building, I don't wonder if the doors open in or out, if there are stairs or steps or an escalator, because I have ability privilege. It would be ridiculous for me to stand outside. My nephew, who is a person who is in a wheelchair, if I say to him, what are you talking, why are you complaining about that building? I had no problem getting in. We're differently situated. And so my privilege allowed me to have greater access than his current status. And how ridiculous would it be for me to deny my privilege? It's like, let's get comfortable with white folks saying, yeah, I have some privilege. Like, let me show you what it is. And privilege doesn't mean that you were born with every advantage and wealth, but it does mean that we have a country that was created not for a lot of us on the call, but created for white men, right? And so let's think about when people think, I don't think that's possible. It's, well, in order for me to have my rights, there had to be amendments and cases and bloodshed. Let's just acknowledge that.
Yep.
Let's just speak to it. So
yes.
I think that's where it is. I think you have to get to a place where we're speaking to it, and we are there now. I think in a lot of spaces where at least could start the conversation, and but also that same notion of that we're there. There's got to be also some notion of like self-preservation, protection of your sanity, so that you're not constantly laying yourself bare, and an expectation that people need to do the work before they come to dialogue, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are tons of resources, go out and do the work. In that same space, I would be remiss if I didn't mention a gentleman whose name is Resmaa Menakem, Resmaa Menakem, Meakem, I think. He is a psychologist, psychiatrist out of Minneapolis who specializes in healing race trauma, addressing trauma, discussing it. And he has been in this space for many, many years. But if you go Google his name, go to his site, he currently has a free 5-part course. It's 5 short videos. And even in our, that's something that, again, when I talked about going bravely, our president was like, all right, let's do it. We're gonna do it together as an organization. We watched the videos once a week and then had conversations. Those conversations were painful. They were emotional. They were uncomfortable because they do discuss Black body trauma, white body trauma, policing body trauma. How do you heal in terms of community? And one, even developing the language around trauma and what does that look like in your body and how do you react? I think you don't have this conversation without acknowledging that there's some forms of trauma, but we have never discussed racism, white supremacy, bias as creating trauma, right? We've also are often come from cultures where you're like, the notion is you have it better than the folks who went before you, doesn't mean you're not experiencing some hurt and you should not figure out how to process that, call it and acknowledge it. Because often in these spaces, you're like, is that me? Is that me? I feel like that may have been kind of a microaggression statement that was made, but I'm the only one that's seen it. And so then while your peer is going off and processing the assignment, you're here in your head like, well, that doesn't feel right. But I don't have the language for it. I can't wrap my arms around it. I can't even describe it to bring it to HR or EO or manager. So the more that you familiarize yourself with the language and the terminology, there's power in that as well.
Wow. Wow. Another question for you. If EDC hasn't already, have you thought about creating a visible scorecard to measure progress, including metrics for recruiting, promotion rates, turnover, compensation levels, to keep your company accountable?
Absolutely. We've started that process, and for the last 4 years, we have and we do an internal metrics report, which right now just is focusing on race, ethnicity, and gender, and that is company-wide. And then each individual department, there's a 4-year look back on kind of where we are, where we were, and it's seen by everyone in the organization. It used to be something that was you individual department, these are your stats, these are your numbers, this is women and people of color. But now one of the things around transparency and accountability is no, the entire organization gets to see this, right? They all get to see it. It's there. It lives on our intranet. It's a look back on where kind of the work that we've done and trainings we provide, but each individual department, a review of just kind of those metrics. We are moving to understand and promotions is not a part of that one system because our promotions process is like a 4-step process. Your HR business partners are meeting with the managers to discuss several months before promotion time. Who are you looking? Who have you promoted? What's the data? These are the stats we have on kind of what your promotions look like, and priming them for that. And then when you submit someone for promotion, it then goes through kind of an HR review and then a president's level review. And so it is rare now that it would be a one-off promotion without saying, no, let's look at all the numbers. And so we haven't put those all together. We definitely are looking to expand. And also now what we're looking is to have the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts accounted for in performance evaluations, right? So it's tied into, right, how, like really trying to understand how we capture that and accountability around it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. So given the current social injustice climate that we're in, has things changed in your organization in terms of moving the needle more to hire more diverse leaders or staff? And what is your vision for D&I in your current position for the next 2 to 3 years?
So absolutely, it's changed the needle. We're having different conversations. I can say that we have been having we've been having the diversity conversations and the hiring conversations for a while. So we really have honed into, um, while we should be doing, we are doing greater work in the pipelining and relationship building space to ensure a diverse pool and slate of applicants always. We're exploring kind of we're really looking at our policies and procedures to make sure that folks are, again, thriving when they get in there, but we are really focusing on the getting through the door, right? So if there are a few departments that we're noticing, again, like that's what we're doing. So that we move the needle on, okay, said departments, we notice X is happening. So we're going to work together. We're going to partner, and we are going, we've started, we have one department that has started a pilot with the CUNY program. So we have like an externship program happening through that space. So we are moving the needle in that regard. But I think I am pleased to say we've been having that conversation and have seen the needle move a great deal in the last 4 years. So
Nice.
I'm absolutely proud of. And I think that where I see us in the next few years is moving from the diversity conversation and really settling into the equity conversation. And that is exploring kind of who we are and how we do what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I train and do, work in this space, I created a training, something called Baked In Equity. And that is, I say, often in the D&I space, I've been in the position where folks want to use me as icing, slather me on at the end. And I want to be a key ingredient. So exploring, and I think if you're in the D&I space, or even if you're a person of color, you'll see people who bake things out and then come to you like, you want to check this over? And I go, no, I wanted to be at the table when this was being,
Yeah.
So the notion of really truly exploring, and so that is going slow to explore hiring, promotions. So we talk about a lot about hiring, but I think there needs to be a different look at what your your benefits. Again, like looking at who's being promoted, but also who's being put on performance improvement plans, who's leaving, who's being terminated, what are your travel policies, reimbursement policies, tuition policies, remote work policies, looking at who you are and who you're centering in that space.
That's great. We have a question from the chat. Did EDC struggle with inclusion and equity while working remotely?
This is so hard because I think that who has it wasn't the working remotely, it's working remotely in a pandemic and racial unrest, right? So it's like, which thing do we want to separate out? I will say though that I think it's been a challenge because so much was happening, but I am going to give a huge shout to the employee resource groups. And so at some point I remember feeling like like such a proud parent where I was like, oh, we need to keep people engaged and we need to be checking in. And I go and look in the Teams meeting and I see, my LGBTQ group is already, they're on it. They've created a safe space. They are checking in on all their members. They've created hey, listen, there's a lot happening bad in the world. So send us pictures of your child today and your pet tomorrow. And what's your favorite thing you've eaten, and virtual online cooking classes. And so I have watched I have seen greater collaboration and support and wrapping arms around each other in a space that makes me beyond proud. And I could not do any of the things I do without them. When I talked about leading our organization through the healing racialized trauma, it was my mindfulness group that was like, all right, if that ends at 1 o'clock, we're starting a meditation, a deep breathing, some exercise. And it was intentional about even like that it was going to be, a Black woman or a Black man or a person, a POC person who was leading in that space. So for me, it has been the remote has created space for a different type of collaboration. And I have seen folks supporting each other, virtual happy hours, virtual coffee clutches. My people of color group do every other Friday. They switch from basically let's have breakfast together. And it's like a breakfast together, and bring your pet, bring your child. Our parents group, the same thing. So I've really seen greater collaboration and more of that. Listen, I'm, like, hey, I'm having a tough time on this call, and seeing people wrap their arms around, like, no, listen, your child's crying, that's fine. I'm gonna just turn on the camera. Here's my child as well. So I think all those things matter in terms of creating a space. And I know that was a bit of a muddy answer, but for me, I do remember feeling a sense of relief and pride, and saying to our president, in terms of creating safe spaces, before I could have created a moment of silence for George Floyd, the people of color group with the two other ERGs had already planned it. It was happening. They were inviting me to it, making me aware of it, and saying this is a space. And the first session held, there were nearly 300 people on that call. And so it just, was extraordinary for me.
We have a few more questions in the chat, but I want to ask this last question before we get to those. How can companies ensure that diversity and inclusion is not a temporary movement, but a permanent change in the corporate structure?
Great question. It has to be built into goals, right? So is your company doing goals? Do you have, are those annual goals, quarterly goals? Are you writing that into are you embedding this work into everything you do, right? And so if you are evaluating who you're going to do business with, what company you're bringing in for management, there should be something a blueprint that says, if we all left tomorrow and folks came in, they'd know there's a checklist here. We are looking to do work with MWBEs or companies that have prioritized diversity or have a diverse slate of trainers and consultants. I think it's not one thing. It is looking at each individual department. It is looking at your HR, looking at your budget, right? So there are, I'm sorry, someone's chatting me. There are, I have seen right now across, actually in some places where New York has not been like at the top, San Antonio, Texas, who a year ago, their equity department created a budget equity tool, because when there's going to be downturn, you want to understand how those cuts are going to affect. And so they have a fantastic tool that says, yep, they're going to be cuts, but if those cuts disproportionately affect one neighborhood, one community, one population in this group, that has to go back and be rethought again. So I think it is digging deep into your policies and practices, and that doesn't happen fast. It is auditing 20 policies a year, but it also is looking at your mission statement. It is incorporating into your hiring and promotion. And it's likely having some conversation so people have quick tools to understand D&I, and that they're not looking to the D&I person, and that cannot be one person. That D&I person has to be consultative to say, let me give you the tools. I can consult with you on this, but let's make sure that we have the wealth of information so we can spread that, whether that's a diversity committee, diversity ambassadors. Yeah, so sorry, hopefully I answered that question.
No, you did. So a question from Karen. She says, my former employer systematically reduced the number of African-American sales staff to 1 per team, all Latinas and Asians. The job descriptions always stated bilingual preferred. Is there anything that can be done about this racist behavior?
And I'm sorry, ask that question one more time.
So my former employer systematically reduced the number of African-American sales staff to 1 per team, all Latinas and Asians. The job descriptions always stated bilingual preferred. Is there anything that can be done about this racist behavior?
I would ask questions like, what size is the organization? Are they located in New York City? Do you have an EEO officer? I also serve as the EEO officer at the organization. And so I often remind people of the balance, right? And so I'd ask those questions about if there's an EEO officer or if you have those concerns. I do think I would say to people one, like understanding, being protective of yourself and your space. Is it a question that you feel that you can safely ask without there being some form of retaliation? That's really, so I wouldn't want to give a response that says, go ask these questions, and it's an organization that is behaving badly and there's some form of retaliation. But also, I remind folks that if you're in New York City, to please New York City has some of the most expansive EEO protections. Looking at folks look at the New York City Human Rights Commission site, um, and explore. But I would ask those questions and to see if there are answers. If it's safe, what are those answers in writing? And asking, do you understand the potential negative implications? But also, please know that there are Black folks who are bilingual, and so like that's another thing about what's the level of transparency around what the applicant pool looks like if they are completing an AA plan. So there's so many questions I'd ask about that.
Okay, another question. Were your DEI groups utilizing any internal or collaborative platforms to foster that sense of community, and what was the channel?
Teams and Zoom. So it depends on what they were doing. They were using mostly Teams. And then Zoom if it was going to be like a larger collaboration of folks. And I think my mindfulness group, no, they use Teams as well to do it.
Okay, another question. Can you comment on DEI within an agency that has a majority Black and Brown leadership? Are there unique DEI issues?
There's an assumption that we can't have internalized racism. There's an assumption that we won't have issues of like respectability or kind of elitist attitudes. Those all exist. And it doesn't mean that there still won't be microaggressions, because we're talking about still folks coming from having their own like power, culture, and identity. You will still have impacts if you make, because this is also happens with like D&I hiring, simply because a person is a Black, Indigenous, or person of color does not mean that they have the skills necessary to lead you through a diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. I do urge majority POC institutions to also do and explore the work. And I think one of like super free, easy tests are things like the Harvard Implicit Association test, which is not, it's not perfect, but there are hundreds of tests. And when you look at the testing, even for people of color, when we're talking about like, I think the notion is who's professional, who's qualified. The data shows that people of color still choose non-people of color and associate the basis with those words. And so I think that would be an interesting kind of resource to look at for understanding.
Interesting. So I know we're coming at the top of the hour and I want to be respectful of your time, but thank you so much for being here this evening. I don't think there's any more questions in the chat. I know that there was a comment, somebody said, racism is now a defined pandemic according to the American Psychological Association, which I found that to be quite interesting. But yeah, I guess if there's no other questions in the chat, Erica, I want to thank you so much for joining today. You all can find her on LinkedIn, Erica Edwards O'Neill, Esquire. And on behalf of the Metro New York chapter of the National Black MBA Association, my name is Alicia Suggs. I'm the Director of University and Alumni Relations. This year we are celebrating our 50th year anniversary. We do have our national conference coming up in September 23rd through the 25th, I believe. And we do have a career fair coming up on September 1st. Please register if you are looking for opportunities out there. And thank you again, Erica. This is great. This is awesome. And everyone have a, thank you. And everyone have a great, great night.
Thank you. I look forward, please feel free to reach out to me, as she said, on LinkedIn. I will do my best to respond quickly. Thanks.
Thank you guys.